Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're a creator, podcaster, blogger, or someone who is trying to make money online, then one of the most effective ways to do that will be to have an email list you can write to and sell to. ConvertKit is the email marketing platform designed specifically with creators and online business owners in mind. Get your email marketing set up with ConvertKit by going to placesandprofiles.com/convert. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Chris Merritt about the legacy of Chinese railroad workers on the Transcontinental Railroad and what we are learning about their work through archaeological investigation. Chris is an archaeologist who is Utah's Historic Preservation Officer. Chris and his team have been learning about Chinese railroad workers from a series of excavations along the Transcontinental Railroad site in Utah's West Desert, and they've been working with descendants of Chinese railroad workers to share cultural history and knowledge. For more information, please check out the show notes page for today's episode at placesandprofiles.com/16. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's so exciting to be here.
Well, good. I'm glad you're excited. I really appreciate you joining me here today. So let's just start out with an overview of your work and this current project you're working on. I gave a little bit of a summary in the introduction, but can you talk a little more about this in detail and just why you've been interested in this particular topic in this particular project?
You bet, Adam. It's been a long time coming. So I actually did my PhD at the University of Montana in anthropology and archaeology, where I focused on the contribution of Chinese immigrants to Montana's history. When I moved to Utah back in 2010, I was really fascinated by how prominent a role the Chinese played on the Transcontinental Railroad that was completed here in Utah in 1869 on May 10th. And I was really excited to dive into that history because it's one of those few pieces of American history that basically every kid gets told the story of the Transcontinental Railroad, but we haven't really dove that deeply into the Chinese story. We knew, the big numbers and the contribution, but a lot of that finer grained story I was looking to dig into. And in Utah, we are lucky. We have 87 miles of intact transcontinental byway. It's an old railroad grade that was abandoned, built in 1869, functioned all the way to 1942 when it was abandoned, and slowly reverted back to federal ownership, public ownership. When you look at the over 1,300 miles of the Transcontinental Railroad, most of it's been upgraded, bypassed, destroyed, erased from history. But this section, this 87 miles, still has that moment of transporting you back to 1869. The landscape is still very austere, very limited human occupation, big sweeping vistas without cell phone towers or houses or even cars many days. And so the landscape is there, the story is there. And when we started heading towards the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad's completion back in 2019, the Bureau of Land Management, who's the federal land managing agency for this section of the state, and our office started working to we want to tell this really cool story because everyone's going to talk about the shiny choo-choo trains at Promontory Summit at Golden Spike. But I want to tell that bigger story of all the stories that went into the Transcontinental's construction, but then the next 70 years of maintenance, of which the Chinese provided the bulk of labor from 1869 to about 1900 for the maintenance of the railroad, which a lot of people don't know that. And so that put Utah in an interesting situation of having these long-term Chinese communities in really the middle of nowhere. And so all of these things coalesced, and then you added the last little spark, which was the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendents Association, which actually formed here out of Utah by folks that were very passionate about telling the story. And many of them have stories in their own ancestry of their great-grandfather working on the railroad, being brought here to this country to help build it. And so you put all these threads together, and we had a really perfect canvas to really tell some really cool stories and bring people that history in a much more nuanced way than golden spikes.
Well, and I definitely want to draw out as many of those stories as we reasonably can in the time that we have here today. But before we do that, let's transport ourselves back into time, back to the 1860s, and let's take a look at what Utah was like in the 1860s, as well as how the Civil War impacted this era that we're talking about with the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. So, what can you share with us about Utah in the 1860s, as well as the influence that the U.S. Civil War had on the construction of the railroad and on this time period that we'll be looking at?
History is such a beautiful thing because it provides the context for why all this strange thing happens. That there is no single point in history that led us to suddenly wake up one day and we want to build a railroad. It took a multitude of reasons to drive the railroad's construction. As early as the 1850s, the United States government was thinking about wanting to build a railroad to the new formed territory of California, but it never was practicable. People didn't know how to finance it, and it would have been the largest corporate investment in modern history at that point, and so it just was daunting. Well, then you add in the Civil War, 1861, the initiation of the separation of the Union with the Confederacy in the North, just pitting each other against our nation against itself, and the railroad was this Hail Mary by Congress and President Lincoln to say we need a way to tie together our nation physically, the East to the West, to the gold center of the West Coast and all the commerce in the Pacific Ocean. And this was as good a time as any to go for it. So in 1862, Congress passed and Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act, which was the largest government subsidy of a private endeavor in American history. And what it did was promote these railroad companies to build this transcontinental railroad across the Great Plains from Omaha, Nebraska, all the way to Sacramento, California, and to tie our country together with this ribbon of steel. It was massive undertaking, and it only took government bonds, subsidies, land grants to get the process moving. But the second problem was labor. So many of our folks in the United States was involved in the Civil War. Most of the population was on the East Coast. So they had to draw labor from other places. And you see early on coming from the East, you see Irish Americans, you see Northern African Americans. After the Civil War ended in 1965, you start seeing Civil War veterans being used as the labor force building what is called the Union Pacific side, which the Union Pacific Company left Omaha, Nebraska. And then the Central Pacific side, leaving Sacramento in California, heading eastbound, they didn't have really stable labor. They kept using exclusively white labor. And every time there was a new gold strike, all their workers would disappear overnight to go into the mountains and get rich. And so it took until 1864 for the Central Pacific Railroad to actually experiment with a small section of Chinese workers. And once they had a successful run at the Chinese railroad workers outside Sacramento, Leland Stanford and Charles Crocker, two of the big names in the Central Pacific story and American story, said, we need more. And they put out a call in 1864 for 15,000 Chinese workers to be brought to our country to help build the Transcontinental Railroad on the Central Pacific side. Within a year, they were able to get what we estimate up to about 13,000 workers. And that is also, in a very small snippet, the context of China. China at the same time was going through a massive decade-long civil war, 20 million estimated dead, 30 million what we would consider refugees today, leaving their farms in southern China and Guangdong province, heading to the coast to look for opportunities to support their families. And while their country was in turmoil, suddenly people are like, we have railroad jobs. You can go up into this new place called Gongsan or Gold Mountain, and you can reach your hand into the creek and pull out gold and you can keep it. And that was a really enticing thing for a lot of Chinese men, predominantly, who immigrated in the 1860s. And so the railroad just had this huge labor pool in China, folks that needed work. We had the jobs here, and it just kind of kicked off this really massive investment of Chinese labor. Now, the third piece of the story is the Utah context. Utah was in the middle of this story. They weren't necessarily engaged in the conversation when this thing started, but as both railroads started building towards the center, Utah became sort of that place in the meeting. And Utah leveraged itself to try to control that on some level. But in 1860, let's say April of 1869, before the railroad was completed, the predominant population here in Utah were members of the LDS Church, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was fairly uniform, and that was the primary ethnicity and religion. Most of them were from Europe or parts east in the United States. Just wasn't a lot of other industry. We hadn't had our big mining booms yet. We hadn't had a lot of this influence from external to Utah territory. And most of the folks coming here, even within the church, were pulling handcarts across the Great Plains or taking wagon trains across the plains. And so the leadership here, the territorial governor, Brigham Young, and others said this is an opportunity for us to position Utah to be that crossroads of the West, to really be that place that all commerce going to the West Coast or East Coast passes through. And then we can also leverage it to bring in more of the faithful here to Utah. And so Utah, before the railroad was completed, was fairly monolithic other than our Native American population. And the railroad completely shifted that. The population of Utah doubled in the next decade because that railroad facilitated days of immigration instead of months of immigration. And that just reshaped our entire state. It opened up our agriculture to a world market, our mines that were struggling because they couldn't get the ore out. Suddenly now they could load it on railroad trains and get it out of town. So suddenly it just reshaped our state in 1869.
So what can you tell us about these Chinese immigrants who came to work on the railroad? You obviously gave some context that there had been a civil war going on in China, but what context can you give us on who these people were? And then what stories can you share of their experiences after actually coming to the United States, reaching Utah, and starting to work on the construction and development of the railroad?
The Chinese worker that arrived in the United States in the 1860s predominantly came from Southeast China, Guangdong province, we would know today. Back in those days, it was called Canton. Sort of a temperate, nice area with lots of agriculture. So most folks that were arriving were from that southeast part, ethnic Han Chinese, which is the predominant ethnicity of Chinese in that area. And most of them were men. Most were young men from the teens up into the early 20s, because back then, the predominant way that Chinese families took care of themselves was a patriarchal line. So the men were those that were supposed to go earn money and support the family. And so they left China to arrive here to work on the railroad. So mostly ethnic Han from Southeast China, mostly young men. There's always exceptions to all these rules, right? And they came here hoping to make money. Some came here hoping to bring their families eventually. Others came here to get money, support their families back home, and then eventually return back home. Immigration story is always complex. And the Chinese that arrived here fit that demographic. The second thing that was really, significant about the Chinese is many of these guys were poor. They were farmers. They just lost their land potentially for the Civil War. They had faced famine. They had faced warfare and death and disease. And so when they arrived in our country, many of them were working under contracts from Chinese labor contractors. And so part of their wages would go to support that contract that paid for their immigration, their boat ticket. And so they worked communally together because of both that reality of we're all working together to eventually support our families or go back home. But secondarily, as soon as they arrived, they started facing the racism here in the United States, particularly in California, where the early wave of Chinese before the railroad tried to work in themselves into mining districts and faced a lot of restriction there. A lot of people feared that the Chinese would take all the jobs and dispossess the Native American and American folks in California. So the Chinese that arrived here to work on the railroad came with that background. Most were farmers, many were illiterate. because they just hadn't had proper education because of the situation in China. And then they faced some of the greatest challenges in the Transcontinental Railroad's construction. As soon as you leave Sacramento, you start ascending the Sierra Nevadas. And those Chinese workers were the backbone of tunneling through that solid granite that we know at Donner Summit, by Truckee, California. The tunnels, huge, big enough to pass trains, being blown and hand drilled by Chinese labor at sometimes only a quarter-inch a day. It took almost 3 winters to punch the tunnels through the Sierra Nevadas because of that. But hundreds of Chinese died in avalanches, blasting accidents, cold, hypothermia. But really, those 13,000 laborers that were brought in were just this human battering ram to get through the Sierras. Then they dropped into Nevada. Things improved, but the conditions still weren't great. Not a lot of drinkable water, inhospitable climate for doing the kind of heavy labor. But by the time they land in Nevada in 1867, 68, they're going about 3 to 4 miles of construction a day. And that's raising the bed, laying the railroad ties, putting steel rail in, and then moving the train another 3 miles each day. So by the time these railroad workers arrived in Utah in late March 1869, they were averaging a 3 to 4 mile a day pace, which was amazing. And then as we got closer to the May 10th celebration, where the 2 trains met at Promontory Summit, Utah, the Chinese laborers provided all the backbone for the 10-mile record day, which has never been met by any technology or human labor force since April 28, 1869, where they built 10 miles of track and 58 feet in one day. It really speaks to how they came from this rural background, but by the time they arrived in Utah, these guys were a well-oiled machine of building railroads. And they worked for less wages than the white laborers, mostly $1 to $1.25 a day for labor. White crews were being paid $1.25 to $1.50 a day, but they also had provided food, equipment, and shelter. The Chinese had to provide their own of those 3 things. So it wasn't equal pay in reality. But because the Chinese worked together, it made it okay. They could pool their resources together for buying food and providing shelter for themselves. And to a railroad, that was really attractive. Their sick days were almost zero compared to the white workers. Because if you look at the diet in between, the white workers, many of them Irish or European background, they were subsisting on canned foods, boiled beef, alcohol, and drinking water out of creeks. So it's a great way to get dysentery, giardia, right? Versus the Chinese, it's kind of a story we've heard, but it's reality. Because they drank tea, they had boiled the water. And so they got rid of a lot of the bacteria that was making everybody else sick. And so they were just better fed. They didn't get disease because of just the cultural tradition they brought with them from China. And so when we finally had the railroad completed in May 10th, 1869, the section crews, the maintenance crews that maintained different portions of the railroad completely flipped to Chinese labor by 1870. So if you got on a train in Sacramento and you got off in Omaha, every 5 to 8 miles, you'd see Chinese faces at section camps for the next 30 years. And that tells you how integral Chinese labor was to these railroad companies.
Yeah, well, I want to return to that here in a moment, but let's go back to May 10th, 1869 here momentarily, where they're driving the Golden Spike into the ground at Promontory Summit, Utah, completing the Transcontinental Railroad. When this happens, when this grand celebration of the completion of the railroad occurs, what sort of recognition do the Chinese laborers receive? Is there any recognition? Are they present when this occurs? Or are they largely ignored from this larger narrative that's being given at the time upon the completion of the railroad?
It's all things in history. It's complicated. Before the May 10th event, like it had been originally scheduled for May 8th, and then due to a derailment and also some striking railroad workers in Wyoming, it got delayed 2 days. there were hundreds of Chinese laborers at Promontory Summit up until that May 8th period. And the railroad companies did invite some of the leaders to have dinner with them and recognize them. But as far as like a public recognition, the Chinese weren't included. But honestly, a lot of the Irish, Black, Native American railroad workers were also not recognized on that May 10th ceremony. And one of the classic photos is the champagne photo, the two trains facing each other with the two conductors or engineers hanging off. And there's no Chinese in those photos. Historians believe there might be one in there, but there's a gentleman holding a hat over his face, blocking him from the camera's view. That's the closest we got to public recognition. Like they made the news, like the newspapers covered that Chinese had built it, but as far as like pats on the back, it went to the financiers, the capitalists, and the politicians, not to the workers. And that's the same for the Irish, the LDS, the Mormon workers. And because the Chinese were 3/4 of the workforce, they got shunned from that great ceremony on May 10th. And the other reality is they cost the railroad companies money. So those guys were back to work, fixing portions of the railroad that had been built quickly or extending new spur lines or doing sidings. And so a lot of the workers were back at work during that celebration. But it took 150 years for us to really recognize the importance of the Chinese on this transcontinental. Because even in the 1969 100th anniversary of the Golden Spike, the Chinese Historical Society of America out of California were all ready to give a presentation, and then they got bumped during the event because of celebrities. And so it took us really till 2019 to really honor those workers and their contributions to our nation's history. And it was very intentional. The state of Utah created a commission, and they put Chinese railroad workers as one of those people we want to recognize this time around. And so it was really nice to see the intentionality. Like, we're going to fix at least what we can of this narrative.
Well, that's certainly encouraging to hear. And we'll, of course, fix what we can here. And I do want to get into some of these stories from these decades in which these Chinese laborers were serving as maintenance workers after the railroad was completed. But before we do that, let's go back to painting a picture and describing this area that you're looking at. So you mentioned earlier that in Utah, there's this stretch of area about 87 miles where the railroad used to exist, where it's almost like being transported back to 1869 with this austere setting. And I know that some of your work is centered around the now ghost town, but this previously somewhat thriving town of Terrace, Utah, that used to exist. So what can you tell us about this area that you're studying, the town of Terrace as it used to exist, and what this stretch of Utah looks like that would be such that it would transport people back to 1869 in a sense?
Austere is the great one-word descriptor, but I'll paint some colors. Brown and gray. Because this arm of the Transcontinental Railroad went around the north part of Great Salt Lake, it is what is called the Great Salt Lake Desert. It is pieces of greasewood, which are spiny little green plants that can pop your tire. It's sagebrush, it's small bits of bunch grass, but if you walked it, for every foot that you might touch on a plant, you're probably doing 10 feet that is on just bare salt earth. A grayish, brown, salty soil that blows when the wind blows. It's so dry year in and year out that it actually forms crust of cryptobiotic soil in places where basically bacteria is growing on the dirt because it is so dry. And it is huge vistas. I think a lot of listeners that don't visit the West, it's hard to convey that I can be on a portion of this railroad and see 143 miles away. I can see a mountain peak that far away from portions of the railroad grade, looking across Great Salt Lake to the southeast. And so as you see the Wasatch and you hear about a great ski, And that snow is being driven by Great Salt Lake and the action of, cumulus clouds picking up moisture and dropping it in the mountains. Well, that moisture is coming from this big expanse of salty water. And as that lake recedes or goes up, we get left with more and more salty soil. And so if you were a 1869 train passenger, let's say August of 69, this would probably be a part that you would not really necessarily be peering out your window at. To me, it's beautiful in its simplicity, I guess, is that it's just a uniform color of brown and greens and low grasses, no trees, salt pans out in the distance, and huge vistas that you can see that far distance and see Whitecap Mountains, but you're not near them. And you are out there. There's no cell phone towers. There are no houses. There's a few small ranching communities, but they're still 15, 20 miles from the railroad grade, closer to the base of mountains where there's water. And when this railroad was built, there was really nothing there. When that railroad was abandoned, still nothing there. All the towns that sprung up along that railroad line to service the trains, this is my transition to Terrace, as soon as the railroad decided to say, we're moving operation and we're going to build the Lucin cutoff, which goes right across the center of Great Salt Lake, this northern branch became incredibly abandoned. And while they finished that Lucin cutoff in 1904, it took until 1942 for the railroad to finally abandon this section. And at that point, they took the rail off, melted it down for World War II, pulled the wooden cross ties off, and then used it as a road until the 1970s and 80s, when the Bureau of Land Management turned it into a backcountry byway where you can drive it. And it's out there. I always tell people, if you're going to drive this byway, have 2 spare tires, because every mile of track had 3,300 railroad ties. Each railroad tie had at least 4 railroad spikes in it. And every time they replaced that railroad tie, they just chucked the spikes to the side. And so those are going to go into your tire more often than not. And so as we moved into the 1940s, it became back to nature, very much back to what it would have looked like before the railroad was completed. Now, Terrace sits in this desert. It sits in between nothing. And its inception was really purely happenstance of location. The railroad, the Central Pacific Railroad, needed a midpoint between Elko, Nevada and Ogden, Utah, to maintain trains. And steam trains need a lot of care and feeding. The old adage is, for every 6 months a steam train ran, it was in the shop for 6 months. And so you needed shops, because what happens if a train broke down in these huge expanses of the American West? And so Terrace was selected as a midpoint to maintain trains. So they built a 11-bay roundhouse where they could pull trains off and do maintenance. And they had coal sheds, they had water. And then to manage all those workers, suddenly all the businesses sprang up: hotels, restaurants, bakeries, meat shops, houses, saloons. All to service largely the railroad traffic, whether the workers themselves or those stopping at Terrace overnight to grab a bite to eat, stay in a hotel, and then keep on moving to California or eastward. And so Terrace sprung up from the desert in 1869 in the middle of nowhere. They had to pipe in water 13 miles in a buried pipeline built from redwood logs to bring water from the mountains to the town. And it was booming. 1870s, 1880s, Terrace had 5, 6, sometimes even estimates up to 1,000 people living in it as they serviced the trains, but also some mine districts 30 miles away. And so Terrace was bustling. It had a band, it had a school, it had a library, it had a garden and fountains and planted trees. But by 1900, when the railroad decided to bypass this northern branch because of high elevation, and it cuts 40 miles off, you go right across the lake, Terrace poofed. It disappeared. As the railroad shifted its labor force, the need to stay there, the businesses, they disappeared too. It's the story as old as humanity. If you have a single industry economy, as soon as that industry moves, that town's gone. And by 1901, it was mostly abandoned. A fire swept through, burned downtown. What didn't get burned, the railroad moved to other locations, and it went back to desert. And if your listeners do a Google map search of Terrace, Utah, they'll probably get a pin to the cemetery, which is the only real named place left on Google Maps out there. But your listeners can look at the aerial and just see the sand dunes and the grease woods and the nothingness, which I think is part of its allure to me today, is when you go out there, you're not dealing with people. You're dealing with nature and history.
One of the best ways to make money online is via email marketing. Even with the prevalence of social media use, building an email list and writing interesting, informative, and entertaining emails as part of a strategy to sell to the people on your list is still possibly the best and most effective way to make sales and increase your revenue. I use ConvertKit for my email list with the Places and Profiles podcast, and I highly recommend it. ConvertKit is a tremendous platform with a great reputation and is designed specifically for creators, bloggers, podcasters, and online business owners. ConvertKit has tremendous functionality and is very intuitive and easy to use. Get your email marketing set up today for your blog, podcast, or online business by going to placesandprofiles.com/convert. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/convert. Well, and I definitely want to talk about that Terrace site a little more here shortly. But let's go back to these Chinese railroad workers who you said they weren't just integral to the construction of the railroad, but it was decades of maintenance after the completion of the railroad, where in a lot of cases, they were even more notable, or at least there were a lot more stories that came during that time. So what are some of the stories that you can share with us during this period where the Chinese railroad workers were dealing more with the maintenance of the railroad than the construction of the railroad? And how did the Chinese Exclusion Act coming into law in 1882 affect these Chinese railroad workers during this time period?
The stories that we know are sadly oftentimes anecdotal. And I want to start there. Is when we look at special collections and museums and diaries, oftentimes we see the written record of literate folk, powerful folk, but also European American. A lot of the Chinese that worked on our railroads for potentially 30 or plus years, we don't have a lot of their stories. A lot of their stories were going back to China when they were mailing letters to their loved ones. And so we don't have, honestly, a lot of first-person narratives of what this life was like for a Chinese worker out in northwestern Utah in this period. That's where the archaeology work that we're going to talk about in a bit comes in to tell those stories. But ultimately, every 5 to 8 miles, you would have a section house, which is a little crosswing wooden house the railroad would build, 1870, 80, 90, even 1900. That house was Irish, predominantly 2 Irish guys, maybe an Irish guy and his family. They were the section foremen. They were the overseers. And then nearby, segregated, was a bunkhouse where the workers were. And for those 30 years, 1870 to 1900, there was 12 to 15 Chinese workers in the bunkhouse. And that pattern, I could drop you into Reno, Nevada, or Rock Springs, Wyoming. The pattern repeats that demographic, which is fascinating to me. Thinking about these 2 Irish guys, many probably still had Gaelic in their history, in their lexicon, working 7 days a week with these 12 to 15 Chinese workers who probably didn't speak any English themselves, or very broken English, largely to the tasks that they were doing. And so that would have been a cultural experience for me to just sit in and just watch how that interaction played out. But they were the mainstay. They were out there every day to make sure the rail wasn't broken, or that there wasn't a washout, or to build new trestles or spur lines. They were working hard labor, 10-hour day shifts, 6 days a week, in these very isolated camps. It's a juxtaposition in my mind, because you're in the middle of nowhere, you're very isolated, but you are on the Transcontinental Railroad, which connects the entire world. And so it's this interesting juxtaposition. As much connection as we had, these guys were ultimately disconnected from other human contacts. But they could get goods on the railroad. They could sell letters on the railroads and telegraphs. So they were connected in a way, but in a very isolated landscape. We know that Many of the railroad workers that lived and worked for the next 30 years were veterans of its construction. The reason I know that is because their ages. Every time the census came out, every decade, those workers' ages jumped about 10 years. And so that means that the same guy who started building that railroad when maybe he was 18, by the time 1900 rolled around, he was pushing 50, doing the same job he was hired for when he was 18. And the reason is what you mentioned, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, is the little told story is very shortly after the railroad was completed in 1869, both railroad companies went bankrupt. They'd overextended themselves. There was some bad deals. And so both railroad companies went bankrupt, which led our nation into an economic recession in the 1870s. And that recession caused a lot of unemployment, a lot of depressed wages. And folks started saying it's the Chinese are the fall guys. They're the ones that are, coming here, taking low-paying jobs. The labor unions didn't like the Chinese because employers could bring them in and break union strikes. Wages were being depressed, and then they were sending all their money home. And so all that agitation led finally to 1882, the first federal legislation that barred the immigration of an entire nation to our country, and that was China. And that is what we call closing the gate in 1882. And after that point, it really wasn't legal to any Chinese person to immigrate to our country, especially laboring classes. 1892 came around, so a decade later, the federal government's like, this is working really great. We've kind of stopped the immigration problem that we're having with the Chinese. The population's starting to decline. Let's make it better. And so in 1892, they passed what's called the Geary Act, which is the first federal legislation to require photo IDs to be on your person at all times. And it was only applied to Chinese in our country. If you were found without your papers, you could be deported. And so that then spurred a whole nother wave of illegal immigration, folks getting falsified papers, smuggling across, especially the Canadian border into the United States of Chinese workers, because the need for the labor hasn't changed in our nation. But now we have to find ways to get the labor in. And by the mid-1890s, we start seeing the railroad companies, mining companies start looking elsewhere to fill those cheap labor needs with new immigrants. And so we see in the 1890s an upswell of immigration from Japan, because the railroad workers by 1900 were replaced by Japanese laborers. That's when we see the increase of Italian, Greek, Slavic railroad workers was around 1900 when we start seeing all these new immigrants now replacing those jobs that had long been held by Chinese labor. It took until 1943 for the federal government to repeal the Exclusion Act. And that was only because the Chinese government refused to ally with us in World War II unless we removed that immigration block. And so it did effectively break Chinese immigration to our country. And when I work with the Descendents, that impact is very visceral. The connection to who came in the 19th century to their story, it's like two worlds. In most of my heritage and a lot of other folks that are maybe more European American, that lineage is fairly linear, right? We know who came where and when they left and who they had kids with and all that. Well, there's this huge break in Chinese history and American history because of the Exclusion Act. And most Chinese to our country are second waves after World War II because of the impact of the Exclusion Act.
Well, and I want to return to the work that you're doing with descendants of these Chinese railroad workers, as well as some of the artifacts that you found here in a moment. But before we do that, a part of the experience of these Chinese railroad workers, of these Chinese laborers that we haven't really touched on yet, are some of the attacks and some of the violence that was faced by these individuals. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the violence that they suffered through and had to endure in many cases?
Yeah, and it circles back to something I said earlier, is working communal help the Chinese, oftentimes for protection. Because the Chinese occupied a very low social rank in American society, violence was commonplace to Chinese. whether in Utah or beyond. And then you add in the gasoline that was the 1870s anti-Chinese movement for immigration, and the violence only increased. When we look at Utah history, we only have 4 or 5 documented lynchings based on race. One of those is a Chinese man on a railroad town. And again, for a very classic lynching reason of perhaps having dealings with a white woman. The records are very scanty because we don't have a lot of great records in it because it was a lynching. It wasn't like there was a proceeding to justify their murder. But when we look outside Utah, anti-Chinese violence was widespread in America. And that's why sort of the modern Asian hate that came out of the 2020 period is not new. It's a cycle. And a cycle that goes back to the first arrival of Chinese in our continent. And it's just been applied to other groups as they've arrived. And if you look at the 19th century, we see Chinatowns being burned to the ground in mob arsons. So Los Angeles, Denver, Butte, mob violence in these communities. We have San Jose, their Chinatown was burned down 3 separate times, all 3 times under mysterious circumstances. You had Tacoma, Washington, where they passed a no Chinese occupancy law, and they loaded and seized all the Chinese property and then kicked all the Chinese out, loaded them on boxcars and took them out of town, effectively erasing the Chinese presence in Tacoma, Washington. The most violent and deadly is the Rock Springs Massacre, which was along the Transcontinental Railroad in Wyoming. And this in the mid-1880s, the Chinese were being used in the coal mines, which was kind of an unusual place for Chinese to be found in the 19th century. And they were brought in kind of as strike breakers. They were, the white labor was on strike for wages and everything that a union strikes for. The railroad company brought in the Chinese to replace it. Violence ensued. Some of the striking workers dressed as federal marshals to corner the Chinese in Chinatown, and then 3 separate mobs marched through Rock Springs, shooting, killing, stabbing, in some cases locking the Chinese in their homes and starting it on fire, killing them in an arson fire. The railroad actually had to call in the National Guard for Wyoming and their own security force to protect the Chinese. And those surviving Chinese were loaded on trains and sent to Evanston, Wyoming for safety. It's one of the bloodiest, race riots in American history, but we don't know much about it because it was Chinese. Estimates are 27 to 32 Chinese were murdered, and very little justice was ever meted out for those deaths. And the stories continue to go on. But as the population of Chinese decreased in our nation, the threat that they perceived diminished too. And so the death of Chinese by violence, by mobs, decreased in the 19th century. But that was because we'd effectively stopped them immigrating and became less and less of a concern. And then that mob mentality and that violence moved to Italians, Greeks, Japanese.
All right, now, but in the time that we have left, let's return to your archaeological work. So can you tell us about some of the artifacts, some of the things that you found in the fields as you've been on excavation projects to Terrace and to these sites where these Chinese railroad workers lived at one time?
Thank you for that, Adam. A lot of this history is very heavy. And the one thing that I have learned greatly from working so closely with the Chinese community is both aspects are part of history. The hard, the negative, and the positive, and the enlightening, and the insightful. And so that's humanity, right? Every human has those parts of their lives. And so the history is there. We know a lot about it, but the archaeology and the work with the community is starting to help humanize the folks that I don't have names for. We don't have photos of, unlike most of my ancestry. And so the archaeology fills those gaps of those history books. And so we've worked out on the Transcontinental Railroad on federal land where these sites are protected from looting and vandalism by being a federal law. But in the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of bottle hunters and diggers that would go out there and dig for things that they could sell or put on their mantle, and it's caused some damage. But when 2020, we did one limited excavation in Terrace in Chinatown, which was spatially segregated. We just started some test units, and the amount of things, we call them artifacts, we call them material culture, was staggering to me. How much was still there? Because you put yourself in a looter's mindset. They want whole things. They want whole bottles. They want coins. They want things that they could sell. To an archaeologist, the broken bits, tell us just as much as whole objects. And as we dug into the sand dune in Chinatown, the aha moment was when we dropped in on floorboards covered in a sand dune since probably 1900. And those floorboards, the last person to have walked on those floorboards was most likely a Chinese man who had built our nation's railroad or brought here to maintain it. And then all the things that we found around it tell us about that person. The house was modest. We fully excavated it in 21, and it was only a little over 6 feet by a little over 9 feet, so about 2 meters by 3 meters. Using the metric system, nobody freak out. It's how archaeologists talk. But then from the excavations, we recovered almost 4,000 artifacts. And these range from imported Chinese porcelains, their tableware, different patterns of these really beautiful porcelain bowls with blue patterns or flower patterns. That was their table settings. And then stoneware jars, these dark brown vessels, very sturdy, that would have been brought here with their food in them. So pickled duck eggs, dried fruit and vegetables, and salted fish. All these things would have came in these storage jars. Then we have personal objects. We found clothing fragments like denim, which is not surprising for a Western town, but also horsehair decoration. So maybe a decorative tunic, something that was more black and formal. We found one piece of coiled human hair. Now, not to creep everybody out, we've had extensions and weaves for a while in our world history, and this was actually a fake braid. So many of the depictions of Chinese in the 19th century, they have those long braids on the back of their head with sort of a shaved front. Well, that was a sign of loyalty to the emperor. And so a lot of those men would oftentimes cut the queue off, the braid off, when they worked here because it got in the way of their job, but they would always have a replacement queue. And so we found this braid of human hair. I mean, you can't get much more personal than that and bring you back into that history. The food, we found fish vertebra from the Pacific coast where the Chinese had their own fisheries. We had fish bones from China that probably were packed in salt or vinegar and sent here for consumption by Chinese workers. We had Chinese olive pits, cherries, melons, coconut shell, all in a sand dune in northwestern Utah, left there by Chinese workers who built our nation's railroad. I mean, you can't get a more weird story than that. But that shows you how that railroad helped connect these workers to their continental home and how that helped them continue their cultural tradition. The artifact I always end with is every archaeologist gets asked the same question. So please don't do this to any of your archaeology friends out there. What's the coolest thing you ever found? Because every archaeologist I know is going to tell you a story that's probably going to underwhelm you. Because you expect it to be the Ark of the Covenant or something like amazing, when in reality, we view the simplest pieces of history as important. The story that object tells is more important than the object in many cases. And one of the volunteers was excavating, and they yelled me over, and we use screens, quarter-inch screens, so the artifacts get caught in it. And I'm like, what is this? And they hand me this gray slate, which isn't natural to that area. I'm like, that's interesting. And I flip it over, and the edge of it is all hand carved. And actually, just Saturday, a Chinese community member was like, that's a pomegranate that's been carved down there. And what that is the decorative edge of a Chinese inkstone. And that artifact just puts such a personal imprint on the occupant of that home that we excavated. Because an inkstone is what you take a solid bar of ink, sort of a square black ink, you put it on this slate with a little bit of water, you grind it into a liquid, and then you can use a calligraphy brush to write. So that artifact transcends 150 years of history to tell me that occupant who came here with all this historical context was literate. Who was he writing? Was he a storekeeper? Was he writing his family? Was he imploring them to come to the United States, but they weren't allowed? Was he writing home? Like, I'm going to come home. I'm going to come home. Did he ever get home? To me, that artifact just opens up a person more than the Chinese that we've talked about for an hour at this point. And now I'm getting a refined person, a literate person. And then I'm thinking about our community, and like, he was probably helping the non-literate folks in his community in Terrace, Utah, perhaps send letters home because they couldn't themselves send letters home. And so it just really makes the story come together. And the Chinese community that we work so closely with, they've been part of this from the beginning. They're the ones that asked us to do the excavation. Most archaeology, we drive our own research. The Chinese community asked us to do this because they wanted their history told. They wanted their history saved. And so the excavation and these artifacts will all be part of a new Museum of Utah that we are building on the state capitol grounds. And these artifacts will be there to help tell the story that for 150 years plus we've forgotten.
Absolutely. And before we wrap up, can you talk a little bit more about the individuals from the Chinese community in Utah, these descendants of these Chinese railroad workers that you've been fortunate enough to be able to work with during this archaeological endeavor and throughout this process?
Thank you for asking that, because I would not be here telling this story without the partnership that I have with my Chinese community friends. And this started out with a field trip we did in 2018, where we took members of the Chinese community and other VIPs and built up to the 2019 celebration. And this was the first time they had seen this part of the railroad and visited and handled artifacts that their great-grandfather might have actually owned. And so the spearhead of it was Judge Michael Kwan. He is now passed. He was the first Chinese-American judge in state history. And then his sister, she was then State Representative Karen Kwan. She's now State Senator Karen Kwan, was the first Chinese American legislator in our state's history. So talk about a power brother-sister couple. And then you add in Margaret Yee, who's been in Utah for almost 60 years, building restaurants and building a community. The community sees her as the matriarch of the Chinese population here in Utah. And she's a businesswoman. She's passionate. She's also like the sweetest human being that anyone will ever meet. And then you start adding all those other members of the railroad descendant community. Not all of them have ancestors that worked on the railroad. Some of them probably do, and they don't know it because we can't find their records in a history book. We can't find genealogical connections. But Karen and Mike Kwan, their great-great-great-grandfather worked on the Central Pacific Railroad. They had a Central Pacific stock certificate in their family history growing up. And so a lot of it's oral history. Margaret E., very similar story, that she knows her great-great-grandfather was on the railroad, doesn't know what happened to him, doesn't know where he worked. Maybe he was in Utah, maybe he was in California. And so these folks have this personal connection, but many of the Chinese community just like, these are our people. This is my history as much as it is a direct ancestor's history. And that passion influences the stories that we can tell. And so the BLM and I have worked passionately to make sure that those community members are part of these discussions. They're part of these decisions. We're doing what they want us to do. We're telling the stories to help them share with everyone what their ancestors did.
Well, Chris, I want to thank you so much for joining me today and for being so generous with your time. Before we conclude this conversation, if someone listening to this wants to learn more about your work and about what we've discussing, where would you direct them? And then is there anything that you feel like is critical to understanding this story that we've neglected to touch on so far today that you would like to add before we end this conversation?
No, thank you, Adam, for inviting me to this. I really appreciate the venue, and I feel it's part of my responsibility to the Chinese communities to continue telling these stories and to get people informed. I'm going to wax poetic too. Our nation's first three transcontinental railroads, this one here in Utah, the Southern Pacific from Texas to California, and the Northern Pacific from Washington State to Minnesota, all of those were 3/4 Chinese labor. 1882, both of the other two railroads were completed. Both had 5,000 to 8,000 Chinese laborers. And so you have to put it in that macro lens that without the contribution of Chinese labor, the face of the United States would not look the same. I don't care where you live. So that's one thing I want people to understand. The second thing, we're learning every day. That's the beauty of archaeology. Every day I go out there, I find something new. I find something innovative. Like, I didn't think that for a million years I would find intact fish vertebrae from the 1870s for fish that we could identify back to China. So what's still out there? What are the stories that we haven't told? We excavated one house out of potentially 50 to 60 houses in Chinatown. What do those other houses have to share about the occupants? And not just the Chinese. I'd love to work on the other parts of town where the other immigrant groups and the other folks were living and having businesses, because it's all part of an American story. I've just focused on this one thread that weaves so great with everybody else. And so the functional story to me is when you visit cool archaeological sites or you're on public lands, ponder who lived there, what were their stories like? Because I think if you ponder and you make that physical connection, your respect will increase for leaving those things where you find them. That without those things being there to tell us the story of the past, if you pick them up and take them away, they lose that storytelling ability. And so when you visit cool places, visit with respect. Visit with respect for their story, not necessarily for your perspective. And then if you want to learn more, I talk a lot. So there's some YouTube channels. The Utah State Historic Preservation Office, we have a YouTube channel where I do have a full-blown, in-depth lecture on the Terrace excavations we did. We also were featured very awesomely in a 2022 Smithsonian Magazine article that's online. The photography is beautiful. The journalist stayed with us both weeks we were digging out there. And so the photos are amazing. The weaving of storytelling is amazing. And then we also, our COVID project was working on a history of the railroad line in Utah. We call it Rails East to Ogden, Utah's Transcontinental Story. And it's a free publication because it's through the Bureau of Land Management, a federal agency. So it's available online. And if you just Google, you're going to find more and more stories. And if you're ever out in Utah, please, go visit this backcountry byway, go drive it, get a good rental car and a spare tire, and enjoy immersing yourself in history. It's an amazing landscape. And I did almost 60 tours, day-long tours, because 3-hour drive from Salt Lake. I never had somebody say that wasn't a magical event to go out there in that landscape, visit those sites, and learn about that history. It's transformative.
Well, it certainly sounds like a magical experience, and I hope that I get to experience it at some point here before long. But in the meantime, I want to remind everybody that the show notes page for today's episode can be found at placesinprofiles.com/16. So all of those wonderful resources that Chris was just talking about will be linked to and available from the show notes page, which again is placesinprofiles.com/16. And Chris, again, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today and for coming on the show to shed some light on these Chinese railroad workers, their story and their role in the Transcontinental Railroad and its construction and its maintenance, and for helping us explore their lives and their importance to the story of Utah and the story of America. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you to listeners for hearing the story.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.